Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Money Makes Cyberattacks Go Around, How Stealing Data is Easier Than Stealing Dollars. My name is Nathan Rowe and I'm going to be the presenter today. I'm the Chief Product Officer and a co-founder here at Evident. So to start out, I think it's important to kind of frame data as both a commodity and a liability. And I think even you could consider it an asset. We obviously have data that's needed to be used as part of our business. It's mission critical, whether it's personalization or whether it's data that we're creating and using to offer a service. Often data more so now than ever is at the heart of the businesses that are out there. But as you think about it as a liability, obviously that data is valuable and can be used, really all over the place. And I think we see, this continued trend where data, because it's difficult to secure and because it's so valuable, it's very lucrative to go after. And there's just more and more breaches that end up happening. The magnitude and the size of them, continues to increase. So, you look at some examples that we've got listed up here. But the recent ones, the Marriott breach that happened at near the end of last year, or Collection One that was announced just a few weeks ago, or even as recently as the past 24 or 48 hours, the folks that brought us Collection One have another record set of about 100 million records that's included there. It's so valuable that we continue to see these trends, and I think because you look at it as a commodity and it's easy to trade and monetize it, it makes it very, very lucrative for the attacker to be able to go after. So, the trend is obviously with data being stolen and data being attacked, that it continues to be, a prolific problem that impacts all of us in business, and it continues to get worse year after year, and it's hard to secure. It's very, very challenging to secure. So, before we go into some of the challenges associated with protecting it, we'll cover why are people coming after it? Why are cyber criminals coming after it? And there's a handful of reasons that are pretty easy to summarize. I think the most obvious one, or the most obvious one to us at least, is that there's marketplaces out there. Just like you can go sell a car, you can go sell products on eBay. There's effectively dark web marketplaces that are out there for this data that's been stolen. Once it's stolen and it's easy to attack. GM, I just got a comment that the audio is not working. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Got it. Excellent. So whoever put that comment in, I would recommend dropping off and then reconnecting. Hopefully that would address the challenge there.
Or they could also click on that orange button which says Get Live Support Now. They may be able to help you with the audio issues.
Oh, excellent. Thank you for the suggestion. So continuing on, just to go back, so the data being able to be monetized. So these marketplaces exist out there. It's very easy to transact in it. They typically use some form of cryptocurrency for anonymity, and individuals that are able to find and retain data are then able to turn it around and sell it, and that's really powerful. Obviously, from thinking about it just in economic terms, there's a robust and mature marketplace that exists. I know if I go steal data, I'm going to be able to profit from it. And I'm going to have, I'm not going to be connected to it. And I don't need to know who the end user is. I don't need to have them lined up before I go steal it. And that ends up being really, really interesting. And I think when you start to connect the dots, it's actually easier to steal data than go after a currency or something that has, more direct, tangible monetary value. Because it's a commodity, it's pretty easy to go after. And there's people that are actively willing to go pay for tens of millions or hundreds of millions of records, and then they're able to go do something with it that's obviously more impactful to the end user. And we see because data is so central to everything, when we sign up for services, we're creating accounts, we're leaving fingerprints, and because we do so much online, there's more proliferation of data with a wider range of companies that aren't always don't always have a perspective, of security or of a, privacy first type of mentality. And, what that ultimately means is that, our data inevitably is going to be breached. There's no lack of examples of that out there, and we're going to continue to see that trend, increase. And that's, again, because our data is valuable and people are able to go monetize off of it. So then moving on and thinking about, can you afford a data breach? And these are some stats that are pulled up both from a more U.S.-centric view and then a global view. And the answer is really it's expensive. So when there's a data breach, there's often the cost of the remediation, the investigation, the postmortems that happen. But then what the brand damage is, what you have to do to offer products and services to individuals that might have been impacted by the data breach. What there might be kind of an ongoing impact to the customer base, people that, as an extension of that brand damage end up leaving you as a customer, or, abandoning use of your service because they've lost trust or confidence in it, really adds up. And, we kind of look at this as, it is an impact. There's obviously risk and liability associated with the data breach. And there's, typically the cost and investment to protect it, and the cost and investment to minimize the risk associated with it is often far lower than the cost once there has been a breach of significance. And this is anything from policies and technology that are put in place to things that you might do from a data minimization standpoint. So really when you start to think about the risk associated with it, what can you do to come in and minimize the data that you have? Are you thinking from a more of a legacy standpoint of, do you collect everything, or do you think of more, I collect exactly what I need, I only use it or store it for the length of time that I need it, and that limits the the chances of that data being stolen. So it's both really kind of wide range of things you do, and some of them have relatively low cost that just require a more thoughtful approach, and some of them end up being much higher cost. But generally, it is far less expensive and far less problematic to approach it from more of a security first or privacy first standpoint than it is to be reactive and have to deal with the consequences of a data breach. Not to mention some of the regulatory scrutiny that may come down as a result of a breach that may have happened. Then moving on, how to protect your data in 5 steps. So, couple maybe seemingly obvious things, but things that as we work with customer base and we examine, the reasons for some of the breaches that are out there, there's some kind of just simple things to do to go out and help protect it. This is in no ways meant to be 100% comprehensive or the entirety of the things that you can do, but are some pretty straightforward things to start to put some restrictions in that in many cases would have prevented very significant breaches. So number one, restrict the devices that have access to data, and that's kind of a broad term. You could think of that more as from an IAM standpoint, what identities and what access is granted based on that identity, where that's granted from. So you could think about, on the network segmentation level, there's certain services and not necessarily a person, but you could talk about host and system segmentation too that has access restricted. So putting the right controls in place to make sure that only the devices and services that are supposed to have direct access to databases do, immediately starts to put up more barriers or makes it harder to transmit, higher sets of data outside of the environment. Certainly, as we've gone to more of a mobile-first world, and as the boundaries of the network perimeter have gotten a lot squishier than they were, in years past, having a very secure approach for mobile access, right? Whether it's BYOD or whether it's enterprise-issued devices, ensuring that you have the right set of security controls on the device. The devices that are coming in, whether it's endpoint security or whether it's access based on location. You really put the right set of segmentation in to protect the devices and protect the access that those devices end up having. And I think it's just a reality that we live in. people expect constant access to their applications and their services, whether it's customers or internal constituents that, might be, IT or business users of different applications. They're going to want to work at the airport. They're going to want to work at home. They're going to want to work over the weekend. They may not always physically be in the office, and that naturally ends up being they're going to use a lot, a wide variety of modalities of devices and form factors to access those. So the business need drives thinking about how you put the right infrastructure and process in place to secure it. Clearly using a strong firewall, next-gen firewall to protect and secure the data, make sure that who's coming in and who's coming out, is very table stakes, but it's always surprises us as we see some of the rules or how lax those rules might be, and what that ends up being, whether it's kind of internal or external access or different levels of firewalls that might exist throughout the network and the segmentation that might be associated with it. Clearly, physical security is essential. It's less common now, but still happens where you see device or data breaches happen because of hard drives not being properly destroyed or laptops being stolen. And it's not uncommon that there's been cases where individuals that wanted to compromise an enterprise effectively were able to via social engineering go compromise the cleaning crew who had physical access. Was able to get in and able to get access to devices, and basically that was the entry point in. So these these individuals that are going after the data recognize the value of it, are very crafty at how they do it, and thinking about kind of that wide range. I know that's maybe a little bit more of an extreme of the case, but certainly not uncommon to hear that's how these breaches happen, or how data or devices may be stolen. And that is not too disconnected from securing the mobile. Obviously, having endpoint encryption, endpoint protection, the ability to wipe devices if they have been stolen, becomes very important too. And then number 5, implementing privacy by design. So thinking about this in terms of, are you taking an approach that is really thinking about data minimization from the start? And it's there's certainly a shift here. I would say the trend goes in this direction from the base of collect as much data as you possibly can. When we think about the more early stages of the internet, and as hardware and persistence got cheaper, that was certainly the mentality. We're going to collect everything. We don't know what we're going to do with it. We don't know exactly how it's going to be used, but we'll collect so much information that's going to be valuable at some point. We'll be glad that we have it. And the trend now is much more towards more of a limited collection, data minimization type approach, or privacy by design. There's a lot of different interchangeable words there, but you start to think about how you can approach this in a way where you're not necessarily collecting or over collecting data. You're really focused on, here's what I need, here's a business application for it, and here's what's going to drive me forward. And I think that's been helped quite a bit by regulation like GDPR, which makes it very clear that you need to have a well-defined use for data. You need to make sure that you inform the user, you get consent, before collecting the data, and then obviously all of the ramifications of data subject access requests. So as a user, in GDPR context, I can go to a company, I can request my data, but also right for erasure. Are more commonly known as right to be forgotten. I can go to a company, I can say, I want you to forget everything you ever know about me, and because of the regulation, the companies have to comply. So certainly there's a lot of tailwinds there moving in the privacy by design, but as you look at legacy applications and legacy architectures, it's not necessarily always the default, or how those things had been implemented by default. So, really interesting there. I think a couple other things to note, as we think about ways to protect your data assets. Restricting data access, I think, is really, really interesting and often overlooked. And this concept that, whether it's someone that might be a little bit financially compromised or in a compromising position and more vulnerable to it, if you look at it from more of a legacy approach of, I'm going to trust the devices in my enterprise, I'm going to trust the people in my enterprise, and they have access to things, you end up really running the risk that if someone is vulnerable to compromise, that they might be susceptible to effectively taking payment for executing the breach from the inside, and that might be actually easier for the attacker than trying to come in through the firewall, through the perimeter that's defined on the network, or coming in and compromising, a system or an application that you have in play. And more and more, because that's the easier route, the route of less friction for the attackers, you see these data breaches starting to trend to be more inside jobs, where they are initiating in the inside, and they are because of that. There's plenty of case studies and examples where that's been the case. So you end up seeing that more and more frequently. Additionally, you end up seeing employees that have, for whatever reason, they have some grudge against the employer, and they're using that in a way that's going to allow them to effectively retaliate, or what they feel is a retaliation, and you see some challenges associated with that. So I think that's one of the aspects that's often underlooked. And I think what's also really interesting on this too recently is that the state actors have gotten much more active recently, and there's a bit of press on this. It's kind of top of mind recently, just because the theory is as it's retaliation for some of the trade wars and some of the other economic activity going on in the U.S. They're actively going after both government agencies, but also going after IP and trade secrets. So it's a little bit more removed from the personal data. But you look at in the past 2 weeks or so, there was a pretty healthy conversation about the Equifax breach being potentially executed by a state actor. And the reason and the rationale behind that was reasonably clear, is that no one has seen that data surface. So obviously it wouldn't be productive for a more of an organized criminal unit to go compromise data and not try to go monetize it on the dark web, where they could make quite a bit of money on it. So the behavior and the ramification from the breach have suggested that be more of a state actor. And obviously those organizations are very well funded, very well organized, very well managed, even much more so than the organized crime associated with it. So you kind of see that factor, that dynamic coming into play, as well as you think about what you're up against, what you have to go protect against, and some of the things, the headwinds that you face as you look at the data that you have, both on the personal data and intellectual property that you might want to protect, and what you would want to do to make sure that data does stay safe and remains in a non-compromised state. So when we start to think about the privacy by design, or the data minimization, there's a lot to be done here, and we actually look at this from kind of some fundamental differences in architecture. The traditional architecture of putting the data in a centralized database, being exposed to a data that you have to process, and even if you don't store it, ends up in your log files because it came through form submissions online, or collected via suppliers or vendors that you have, and ends up processing in log files, or ends up in databases. That's obviously a very significant issue, because typically the log files are not viewed as needing to be that secured, or having the same sort of concerns about data protection, and often end up being a really low-hanging fruit to go after, especially when they're offloaded to third-party services that might be outside of the organization. So thinking about an architecture difference where you have a distributed data model, you might have end-to-end encryption in play, where you're able to have confidence of the data, but maybe not direct exposure to it. Especially when we start talking about factors and techniques like limited disclosure, and then making sure that you're only exposed to the data that's really needed for your business purpose, your business justification, right? Again, along the lines of the data minimization or the GDPR requirements, only go touch what you really need, what you have access to, or what you have a business need for, not necessarily what you have access to. But what you have a genuine business need for, what you're going to action, what's going to provide a differentiated service or product offering to your end customer, and then make use of that data, and then make sure that you secure it. So kind of having that different mindset ends up being pretty important here. So, as we start to get more to a wrap up here, so holding any amount of data is risky, and especially if you do nothing to protect it. I think there's obviously just a wide variety of ways to protect data, and as I mentioned a few slides back, there's no one answer. Then there's typically, when you talk about security and you want a layered approach to security, there's not going to ever be one answer. But thinking about where the data is persisted, how the data is stored at rest, how the data is stored in transit, the things that you have to do to protect access to the data, how you monitor who has access to the data, how you monitor anomalous amount of download. A few years back, the large healthcare organization had gigabytes worth of data downloaded from a database that on any given day should have only seen megabytes of traffic. That's really interesting, right? And should be able to throw flags off to be able to detect it. As is maybe a little bit cliche and overused, but it's an arms race with the cyber attackers, the white hats and the black hats. So it's not that this is going to stop. There's a reality that as more data goes online and more of our economy goes online, that data is easy to monetize, easy to move across, international boundaries, easy because of kind of the limited fingerprints that's left, easy to tie or associate with individuals, harder to tie or associate with individuals, makes it just makes the trend where we'll continue to see more of this, and unfortunately year after year the breaches continue to get bigger and more significant, and that's effectively the reality that we see. When you think about the cost of the data breach, and maybe more importantly help justify investments, the cost is obviously broad and wide ranging. It's not just the brand, not just the trust impact to your consumers or customers and the impacts to the product, but it's what impact do you end up having with regulatory penalties? What impact do you end up having with things that you might extend as far as service offerings to customers, like identity monitoring services or credit monitoring services that need to be put out there, and what lasting impact does that end up leaving ends up being relatively significant. Certainly removing liability for holding sensitive data is starting to be much more of the trend, and that's the data minimization, the privacy by design, thinking about only using and interacting on the data that you really need is the right way to think about how you might proceed there. So, in summary, handful of things to think about and consider with data, but no right answer, but having kind of a constant watchful eye on it and thinking about all the different vectors is exceedingly important. So great, and I apologize, but I didn't mention this. There is the ability to submit questions in the in the form in the webinar, so please do. If you have some questions to submit, we'll take a Q&A session now for the next 10 minutes or so, and if we run out of time, we will certainly come back and follow up individually on any questions that we don't get to. So first question is, what is a realistic approach to consider with data, obviously as it's needed in my business? And I think this is a great question, because we're not going to be here fear mongering and suggesting don't store any data. Storing data isn't realistic. We're not that idealistic. Obviously, data is needed to run a business. It should be considered a liability, but obviously you'll have parts of the organization that also consider it an asset. So I think it's really having that healthy dialogue internally, understanding what the value of the data is, associating the risk with it, making sure that you put the right security protections in place and that you have the right balance there. If there's data that you're collecting that's really not that valuable but is very risky, say for some reason you're using Social Security number as a unique identifier for the customer, I wouldn't recommend that. I think it's just a colorful example. That would be a case where you should really look at, like, do we really need that not uniquely identifiable key for the individual or not unique to my organization, or could we put something else in place? And again, that's probably not a very realistic example, but I do think it's one that could illustrate a type of conversation that you could have as you look at what data you're processing. Do you really need it? Do you need a token to represent some data point, or do you need the actual data point, especially when it gets more related to personally identifiable information or information that could be valuable, about the user. So, it's really just thoughtfully approaching data, making sure you're balancing the value that you get from the data that you're capturing and storing and the risk associated with it, having the right policies and procedures in place. At what point do you forget and erase data about a consumer? And maybe it's not the full account, but maybe it's some history. So if there was a breach that happened, you start to minimize the amount of history that you have, the amount of records that are actually available to be stolen. And obviously there's archive techniques that might come into play there as well. But we as consumers are fickle. We end up using services, we end up leaving services, we end up coming back to services, and kind of thinking about that full life cycle and the impact of the customer journey that could present itself as you start to have less and less data involved is healthy. So kind of a lot to think about, but again, not fear-mongering, not saying don't collect any data. Obviously, your decision to decide how much data you collect, just be thoughtful about it. Great, and a few more questions that are being submitted, so feel free to add yours as any thoughts have come up. But question 2 is, how does a company eliminate the risks associated with user data? I actually think this is maybe a little bit of a trick question, and no means to offend anyone that had submitted that. But the reality is, you need the data, as we mentioned with the previous question, to operate your business, right? It probably is very central to your service or products that you offer. But the reality ends up being is that you're never going to be 100% certain, right? That's one of the guarantees in security, is that you can't be 100% secure. So as a result, it goes back to that kind of thoughtful approach. You just need to make sure that you're balancing the risks that you're taking with the collection and processing of the data with the value that you're getting, and making sure that those things are well aligned. You don't want the risks to outweigh the value. It's less of a problem when the value far outweighs the risks. That's the better end of the spectrum to be on. But there's ultimately no way that you're going to be 100% secure, or 100% protected when you start processing data. It's just putting the right things in place, performing the right diligence, and making sure that you have the right protection. Another question comes in is, what recommendation do we have to identify where we have personal data in the enterprise? So I think this is a very common problem that we see, and it's a great question, just because of the proliferation that ends up happening with data. And I think we would probably put it in one of 2 buckets. Number one, from a development standpoint, and maybe the easier one of the 2 to solve, there are many cases that we've run into where it's easier to make a copy of a production data set from a development standpoint or engineering standpoint, and do the work, do the testing, do the building the new features, the new applications that are being developed on that, than using a contrived set of data. It's richer data, it's more realistic, it has more of the corner cases on there. There's a lot of gravity that pulls the organizations into doing that way. But what happens when the developer makes a copy, they put it on a local machine, they're not thinking about it as much from a security standpoint, and that machine gets compromised or that data gets stolen. There certainly are cases when data sets get checked into GitHub, for example, or passwords get checked into GitHub, for example. Obviously that's not good, and that's not the right way to go about it. So, I think the first category that I would start to investigate is what are the engineering, the software development processes, what data sets do they have access to, and what are they allowed to do, those that do have access? Are they allowed to replicate that copy for non-production purposes? And it's very, very clear here, and that's actually another good tangent on access control. At Evident, we have relatively few engineers that actually have access to the production data set. It's really more of a DevOps function. The engineering team has access to their development systems and their fake contrived data sets, but those 2 things, there's a hard firewall that exists between them, and there's really no overlap that exists. So, it's a great example of how you can put some access controls in place that may not seem obvious that you might need access controls. So then going back to the question, how do I identify user data? I think the second bucket that ends up being a area that you'll proliferate user data is as legacy applications and new applications come online, it's often very hard for these things to share a core data set. And this becomes really interesting because obviously these new applications that come online or these legacy applications that are being served need data to function. They need the data to serve their purpose. But if every one of these applications ends up making a replication of the data, or when data changes, it ends up being copied multiple times, you start to run into a problem that's much more prolific as far as where that data exists and how many places you have to monitor, how many places you have to restrict access, how many places you have to secure and make sure that you've got the right logging and such in place for. The challenge here, which is why I think this is much harder, is that this is not easy to overcome, like putting development guidelines and processes and such in place. Architecturally, it may not be even feasible to solve this. So, this might be more of a problem of understanding and having inventory and certainly having policies in place where this is more of a last resort versus a default, but making sure that you understand from a process standpoint what is going on, where the data is and going out. But I think if you start to look at that category, what applications have access to what data, finding out where that application has its access to its data repository. It may be sharing a single database, and that's fantastic if you're building multiple applications that way. But I suspect as you get into it, more often than not, what we see is that the proliferation of that data ends up being pretty high because just the way these things work. And additionally, when we start to see more and more SaaS services come into play, whether they're used for customer management, or things like that, that data may need to be proliferated because of that too, because obviously two different commercial SaaS vendors have their own database, their own schema. They might want to copy the data to perform their function and their value that they do, which obviously starts to extend that data even outside of your enterprise and your control. I think it's excellent when you look at the SaaS security models. Generally, the SaaS vendors, because they can focus on securing data, as more of their primary job, do a fantastic job at that. That's a general statement, not true 100% of the time, but you do tend to see higher security postures, that versus some of the internal projects that are out there. It's their goal and the impact of their business is obviously much higher, on that front. So. But I think that would be the second category to look at. And then, a third and maybe a little bit more distant category is, when you have business analysts, when you have accounting people that might be making copies of data to perform functions, hopefully that data ends up being anonymized, but, it's easy enough to ask for a dump of a database table. That database table may have personal information. Where does that end up? More likely to be in spreadsheets or, other more personal databases that exist out there, or even SaaS services these days where that might be out, a little bit less in your control. Couple more questions, and then I think we'll get close to wrapping it up. So, how do you recommend alignment at the C level with data protection and compliance? And I imagine just reading into this question, it's a little bit about how to get and ensure funding, about data. I think one thing that I've heard that was actually really good advice that was never really obvious is that the typical IT InfoSec security approach is I need funding or the world's going to end. We're going to lose all of our data, and that obviously is a pretty dynamic argument. Obviously, I'm being a little bit polarizing with the statement, just for purposes of illustration. But that's been kind of the traditional pitch, and obviously we fight for budget, we fight for funding, we prioritize what we do, to have the greatest impact. But in information security, often like buying insurance, it's hard to quantify the value of the ROI. And I think that's a lot where a partnership between someone like a chief data officer and a chief information security officer comes in place, because the perspectives are very different. The alignment and the objective is largely the same. And let me elaborate on that. So the chief data officer is going to look at data as an asset, where the chief information security officer is going to look at data as a liability. It's the same data. It's just considered by two different, groups within the organization, dramatically differently. And I think that ends up being really interesting dynamics, because that will be a forcing function to have a conversation about something that needs to be stored. What's the risk associated with it? How do we quantify the risk? And then what do we need to do to protect it? So if there's value in the data, the value should quantify it in a value to the benefit, whether it's additional customer acquisition, additional customer retention, reduced churn. There's clearly going to be metrics that you can put around that, versus when we start to talk about the liability, well, what do we need to do to protect it to minimize the risk associated with it? And if if it's easy to ask for data, and it's not part of that conversation is what investment has to be made to protect it, which I think is more often than not how that dialogue happens, then we end up having two different threads that end up being disconnected when they should be. So I think, aligning those and forming the right, relationships and connections internally, and making sure that's more of a partnership going in, is really important, and potentially even part of that growth in the business should obviously help fund the security, associated with it. So anytime you're doing anything new, that should be part of that ROI calculation, not just, what's the additional revenue and it's all 100% margin business. It likely isn't. There's cost that has to be applied to it. The other thing, that's really important here as you get the alignment with the data protection and the compliance at the C-level is, align with the profit centers, which we covered, map the security policies that you have against, people, the data and the analytics that you've got in place, implement vendor tools, and really have a plan to orchestrate the policies. I think it's easy to say, here's a policy, we should reset the password, every X months, or we should have a minimum password complexity requirement, making sure you have things in place to, enforce those. And those are two examples that are relatively easily enforced with IAM systems or solutions. But as you get to more sophisticated policies as far as who has access, auditing access on a regular basis, having the right tools to make sure you orchestrate that, ends up being, very, very important way to go solve some of those challenges that are out there. And then one more question, and we'll wrap it up. We're getting near the end of the session here. So what approaches can you take to prevent inside jobs? This is a really, really tricky, very, very tricky question. And I think we covered some of it. So number one, minimize who has access to what. So hands down, right? If you look at a database that sits on a network, if that database is accessible, just even the system is accessible, the server that runs on, you are immediately presenting a problem, and that's obviously not good. So I think as you start to think about the access controls that are in place, whether it's at an application level or a network level, really look at that and fine-tune those to a granular level to minimize who has access to what. As you do that, what you'll find is that there's sysadmins will boil up to the top as having the most access, and they need it to perform their job. So you might want to consider going into more in-depth monitoring, more regular reviews of the employee base, who has access, and what level of vulnerabilities they might present. People that are going through family situations or might be having some financial difficulties obviously are going to be much more likely to be compromised, just because of the situation they're in, and they might see it as as an easy out. So, making sure that you have a good handle on that is more and more considered part of the best practice. And because you've been able to narrow that down to a relatively small population of employees, you're not looking at monitor the entire employee base. So, those would be two initial recommendations. We talked about securing the mobile devices. So, if we talk about the cleaning crew being able to come in and get access to buildings or services, making sure that the devices that might be left behind, do have encryption at rest, do have, just simple things like auto screen, saver policies that require password for entries. Anytime that device is removed from the building or powered off, it requires a password because all the data on the hard drive is encrypted at rest. A whole handful of things that are actually pretty prolific these days. I mean, those services come widely available. They're pretty easy to administer, much more so than they were even 5 years ago. So a handful of things that would be easy, and then obviously MDM. If you have sets of mobile devices that are easily taken the moment their report's stolen, you can issue a remote wipe command. If they ever do come online, they're immediately wiped. There's nothing that anyone can do with them. You really start to limit what can happen with them. But it's no doubt the insider threat is a very challenging problem. It's probably because they're inside, because you need access, or these individuals need access to do their jobs typically. That access obviously is elevated for the small population. That just presents the very, very, very significant risk, and that's why monitoring that would be really, really important. And with that, I think we'll wrap it up. If there's any additional questions, feel free to submit them, and we can get back to you. You can reach us at www.evidentid.com. And if you do want to follow up about any of the ways that our products and services could help reduce the liability associated with data and potentially change data architecture, feel free to reach out. We've got contact forms there, and we'd be happy to discuss how our solutions could make impact to some of the challenges that you do see. I wanted to thank everyone for their time today, and really do appreciate it, and hopefully it was a good learning experience for everyone. Have a great afternoon.